Henry Chatillon and Tete Rouge were of the same age, that is, about 30. Henry was twice as large and fully 6 times as strong as Tete Rouge. Henry's face was roughened by winds and storms. Tete Rouge's was bloated by sherry cobblers and brandy toddy. Henry talked of Indians and buffalo; Tete Rouge of theaters and oyster cellars. Henry had led a life of hardship and privation. Tete Rouge never had a whim which he would not gratify at the first moment he was able. Henry, moreover, was the most disinterested man I ever saw; while Tete Rouge, though equally good-natured in his way, cared for nobody but himself. Yet we would not have lost him on any account. He admirably served the purpose of a jester in a feudal castle. Our camp would have been lifeless without him. For the past week he had fattened in a most amazing manner, and indeed this was not at all surprising, since his appetite was most inordinate. He was eating from morning till night. Half the time he would be at work cooking some private repast for himself, and he paid a visit to the coffee pot 8 or 10 times a day. His rueful and disconsolate face became jovial and rubicund. His eyes stood out like a lobster's, and his spirits, which before were sunk to the depths of despondency, were now elated in proportion. All day he was singing, whistling, laughing, and telling stories. Being mortally afraid of Jim Gurney, he kept close in the neighborhood of our tent. As he had seen an abundance of low, dissipated life, and had a considerable fund of humor, his anecdotes were extremely amusing, especially since he never hesitated to place himself in a ludicrous point of view, provided he could raise a laugh by doing so. Tete Rouge, however, was sometimes rather troublesome. He had an inveterate habit of pilfering provisions at all times of the day. He set ridicule at utter defiance, and being without a particle of self-respect, he would never have given over his tricks, even if they had drawn upon him the scorn of the whole party. Now and then, indeed, something worse than laughter fell to his share. On these occasions he would exhibit much contrition, but half an hour after we would generally observe him stealing round to the box at the back of the cart, and slyly making off with the provisions which Delorier had laid by for supper. He was very fond of smoking, but having no tobacco of his own, we used to provide him with as much as he wanted, a small piece at a time. At first we gave him half a pound together, but this experiment proved an entire failure, for he invariably lost not only the tobacco, but the knife entrusted to him for cutting it, and a few minutes after he would come to us with many apologies and beg for more. We had been 2 days at this camp, and some of the meat was nearly fit for transportation, when a storm came suddenly upon us. About sunset the whole sky grew as black as ink, and the long grass at the river's edge bent and rose mournfully with the first gusts of the approaching hurricane. Munroe and his 2 companions brought their guns and placed them under cover of our tent. Having no shelter for themselves, they built a fire of driftwood that might have defied a cataract, and wrapped in their buffalo robes, sat on the ground around it to bide the fury of the storm. Delorier ensconced himself under the cover of the cart. Shaw and I, together with Henry and Tete Rouge, crowded into the little tent, but first of all the dried meat was piled together, and well protected by buffalo robes pinned firmly to the ground. About 9 o'clock the storm broke, amid absolute darkness. It blew a gale, and torrents of rain roared over the boundless expanse of open prairie. Our tent was filled with mist and spray beating through the canvas and saturating everything within. We could only distinguish each other at short intervals by the dazzling flash of lightning, which displayed the whole waste around us with its momentary glare. We had our fears for the tent, but for an hour or 2 it stood fast, until at length the cap gave way before a furious blast, the pole tore through the top, and in an instant we were half suffocated by the cold and dripping folds of the canvas which fell down upon us. Seizing upon our guns, we placed them erect in order to lift the saturated cloth above our heads. In this disagreeable situation, involved among wet blankets and buffalo robes, we spent several hours of the night, during which the storm would not abate for a moment, but pelted down above our heads with merciless fury. Before long the ground beneath us became soaked with moisture, and the water gathered there in a pool 2 or 3 inches deep, so that for a considerable part of the night we were partially immersed in a cold bath. In spite of all this, Tete Rouge's flow of spirits did not desert him for an instant. He laughed, whistled, and sung in defiance of the storm, and that night he paid off the long arrears of ridicule which he owed us. While we lay in silence, enduring the infliction with what philosophy we could muster, Tete Rouge, who was intoxicated with animal spirits, was cracking jokes at our expense by the hour together. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, preferring the tyranny of the open night to such a wretched shelter, we crawled out from beneath the fallen canvas. The wind had abated, but the rain fell steadily. The fire of the California men still blazed amid the darkness, and we joined them as they sat around it. We made ready some hot coffee by way of refreshment, but when some of the party sought to replenish their cups, it was found that Tete Rouge, having disposed of his own share, had privately abstracted the coffee pot and drank up the rest of the contents out of the spout. In the morning, to our great joy, an unclouded sun rose upon the prairie. We presented rather a laughable appearance, for the cold and clammy buckskin, saturated with water, clung fast to our limbs. The light wind and warm sunshine soon dried them again, and then we were all encased in armor of intolerable rigidity. Roaming all day over the prairie and shooting 2 or 3 bulls were scarcely enough to restore the stiffened leather to its usual pliancy. Besides Henry Chatillon, Shaw and I were the only hunters in the party. Munroe this morning made an attempt to run a buffalo, but his horse could not come up to the game. Shaw went out with him, and being better mounted, soon found himself in the midst of the herd. Seeing nothing but cows and calves around him, he checked his horse. An old bull came galloping on the open prairie at some distance behind, and turning, Shaw rode across his path, leveling his gun as he passed, and shooting him through the shoulder into the heart. The heavy bullets of Shaw's double-barreled gun made wild work wherever they struck. A great flock of buzzards were usually soaring about a few trees that stood on the island just below our camp. Throughout the whole of yesterday we had noticed an eagle among them. Today he was still there, and Tete Rouge, declaring that he would kill the bird of America, borrowed Delorier's gun and set out on his unpatriotic mission. As might have been expected, the eagle suffered no great harm at his hands. He soon returned, saying that he could not find him, but had shot a buzzard instead. Being required to produce the bird in proof of his assertion, he said he believed he was not quite dead, but he must be hurt from the swiftness with which he flew off. "If you want," said Tete Rouge, "I'll go out and get one of his feathers. I knocked off plenty of them when I shot him." Just opposite our camp was another island covered with bushes, and behind it was a deep pool of water, while 2 or 3 considerable streams coursed over the sand not far off. I was bathing at this place in the afternoon, when a white wolf, larger than the largest Newfoundland dog, ran out from behind the point of the island and galloped leisurely over the sand not half a stone's throw distant. I could plainly see his red eyes and the bristles about his snout. He was an ugly scoundrel, with a bushy tail, large head, and a most repulsive countenance. Having neither rifle to shoot nor stone to pelt him with, I was looking eagerly after some missile for his benefit, when the report of a gun came from the camp, and the ball threw up the sand just beyond him. At this he gave a slight jump, and stretched away so swiftly that he soon dwindled into a mere speck on the distant sand beds. The number of carcasses that by this time were lying about the prairie all around us summoned the wolves from every quarter. The spot where Shaw and Henry had hunted together soon became their favorite resort, for here about a dozen dead buffalo were fermenting under the hot sun. I used often to go over the river and watch them at their meal. By lying under the bank it was easy to get a full view of them. 3 different kinds were present. There were the white wolves and the gray wolves, both extremely large, and beside these the small prairie wolves, not much bigger than spaniels. They would howl and fight in a crowd around a single carcass, yet they were so watchful and their senses so acute that I never was able to crawl within a fair shooting distance. Whenever I attempted it, they would all scatter at once and glide silently away through the tall grass. The air above this spot was always full of buzzards or black vultures. Whenever the wolves left a carcass, they would descend upon it and cover it so densely that a rifle bullet shot at random among the gormandizing crowd would generally strike down 2 or 3 of them. These birds would now be sailing by scores